Hello everybody, and welcome to another fun-filled adventure of lecture. Alright, so today we are rather quickly and briefly going to look at two important events. One's a document, the Monroe Doctrine, which was issued in 1823, and the other is the Missouri Compromise, which actually preceded the Monroe Doctrine in 1819. The reason why I'm focusing on these two particular things in this brief lecture is because they set up for us some significant things in the future. Much like when we talked about Thomas Jefferson, we looked at the Louisiana Purchase, we looked at the Embargo Act, and I mentioned the reason why I looked at those is because they had significant consequences, one for the coming War of 1812 and the other for westward expansion. So these two items here are going to have lasting consequences. The Missouri Compromise will lay some foundational, well, let me rephrase that. The Missouri Compromise is going to try to solve a problem of slavery and westward expansion, and time again, that particular piece of legislation gets overruled. And we're going to see that as we get towards the Civil War. The Monroe Doctrine, on the other hand, it sets America's foreign policy for the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th century. And so for these two reasons, I have decided to look at these two topics. Now, as far as the Missouri Compromise goes, all we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a map, and I'm going to explain what it was, and then I'm going to try to give you some insight into why this is important. And then we will briefly talk about what the Monroe Doctrine was. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and dive right in. Okay, so what you're looking at here is, in fact, a map, obviously. The Missouri Compromise, 1819 is when it began to be an issue, and ultimately there will be a compromise that dealt with Missouri, and it will come about in 1820, 1821. Now, I'll get to this map here in a second, but just let me give you some background information. Around 1819, the state of Missouri, as you can see, Missouri admitted as a slave state in 1821. The state of Missouri had requested statehood, and that's well and fine. But what Missouri wanted to do was it wanted to join the Union as a slave state. Now, in 1819, 1820, as you know, the United States is debating whether or not to bring Missouri in, there was an equal balance of slave states and what we would call free states. What I mean by that is, before Missouri requested statehood, there were 11 slave states and about 11 free states, which means that within the Senate, there were 22 senators who would have been pro-slavery and 22 senators who would have been anti-slavery, or Northerners who would have been generally opposed to the institution of slavery. And that's a bit oversimplified, but for the purposes of understanding the Missouri Compromise, it will suffice. And so when Missouri requests statehood, they want to become a slave state. So if the United States had allowed Missouri to come in as a slave state, it would have tipped the balance of power in Congress, and it would have allowed for the slave states to have more representation, which means any time an issue of slavery came up, whether it was about the institution itself or whether it was about the westward expansion of slavery, which is what we see here, when Missouri requests statehood, the debate that comes up in Congress is not about the institution of slavery itself, but it's about, will new territories be allowed to have slaves? Okay? So if Missouri is brought in as a slave state, it will tip the balance of power in the favor of the pro-slavery South. Okay? This created a real potential problem, because there began around 1820, 1830, there is an abolitionist movement. We will talk about this later, but the majority of abolitionists are in the North, and they are fearful that if Congress itself is bent towards the pro-slavery people, or bent towards the desires of the South, then slavery itself could eventually take off and just run the whole country. Okay? And so, you know, the question is, do you then allow Missouri in? Okay, well, of course you want to allow Missouri in. So how do we address this potential political problem? Well, Henry Clay, who was Speaker of the House, he is going to come in and he is going to do what he has become historically known for doing, and that's writing compromises. And so after a series of debates, after a series of moves, the Missouri Compromise of 1820-1821 was struck. Okay, the way that this worked was that if you go up north and you go to what it says there is Maine, Maine was carved out of Massachusetts, and Maine was brought in 1820 as a free state, and then in 1821 Missouri was brought in as a slave state. Now, what this meant was that that delicate balance of political power, it didn't change at all. All that happened was that you added 2 more senators that were pro-slavery from Missouri and 2 senators from Maine who would have been from the northern perspective or generally anti-slavery. Okay, so the Missouri Compromise really didn't solve the political problem. It forestalled it for later politicians to have to deal with. Okay, so that was a significant chunk of the Missouri Compromise. Was we'll bring Missouri in as a slave state, we'll bring Maine in as a free state, and this will maintain that delicate balance of power in Congress. Okay. Now, the Missouri Compromise is going to do one other thing, and this is really the more important aspect. If you take a look at this map, you'll see where it says Arkansas Territory, and there's a red line above it, and it says the 3630 parallel line, Missouri Compromise line. That 3630 parallel line was created by the Missouri Compromise, and basically what that line meant was it said or dictated that in the future, and we're going to see that in the future, the United States is going to acquire significant portions of what you see on this map is regarded as New Spain or independent Mexico. The United States is going to go to war with Mexico shortly and take a good chunk of that land. But basically what this line does is it says any state that is developed north of the 3630 parallel line. So let me say that again. Any state developed or brought into the Union in the future that exists north or above the 3630 parallel line cannot have slavery. Okay, Missouri would be the only state above that line permitted to have slaves. Okay, thus anything below that line, anything below that line would have to be open to slavery. Okay, so north of the line, other than Missouri, no slaves. Below the line, you can have open slave states. Now, the Missouri Compromise is attempting to deal and address with the question of future expansion of slavery. Should new territories that the United States acquire be permitted to have slaves? Well, according to the Missouri Compromise, the answer is both yes and no. If the territory is above the line, then no. If it's below the line, then yes. As we're going to find out, however, as we go to war with Mexico, and as we acquire new territory from Mexico, these questions of whether or not states should be permitted to have slaves or not be slaves, this gets raised again. And ultimately, the Missouri Compromise doesn't solve the problem over the westward expansion of slavery. Okay? In fact, oftentimes, it's just going to create more tension and debate because territories will be created that will be above the line that will be open to slavery, and that's going to upset Northerners. And there will be territories that are trying to be created below the line that people are saying should not be allowed to have slavery, and that's going to upset Southerners. And so the line itself doesn't really solve the problem. It postpones it. Okay? But we're going to be talking and hearing this term of Missouri Compromise come up over and over again. Okay? But I think it's important for us to understand what it was, which is why I wanted to spend this time looking at that particular compromise. All right? So again, very basic. Missouri's added in, slave state. Maine's brought in, free state. We draw a line across the 3630 parallel line. Anything north of it is not supposed to be open for slavery. Anything south of it is open to slavery. But as I've already mentioned, and as we will see, this does not solve the problems. Okay? All right. I'm sure I have now beat that to death. and this will not be the last time you hear of the Missouri Compromise this week. But there you have it. Okay, let's move on to the next topic, which is the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, the Monroe Doctrine. What is this? Well, the Monroe Doctrine is, in some respects, the United States' first official foreign policy or statement of foreign policy. Now, as we watched previously and as we discussed previously under Washington, this isn't necessarily the first act of foreign policy that the United States has had. Let's recall under Washington that we had the Neutrality Proclamation. Under Washington, we had the Farewell Address, and I know there was a film that we watched earlier on this topic, so hopefully this isn't new information to you. If you don't remember the foreign policy under Washington, I have given you a link here to a film. You can see at the bottom of this page it says Washington's Farewell Address. Just go ahead and click on that. It's not a long little video, but it will review and summarize what Washington's foreign policy was. But essentially it was a policy of neutrality. It was a policy where we would be friendly to belligerent powers throughout the world, but we would be impartial towards them. It was a policy where we would not make permanent alliances, but only temporary ones, and ultimately we would just be somewhat isolationist. Okay, but if you would like a review on that, go ahead and click on there. And you can get a sense of what America's foreign policy was before we issued the Monroe Doctrine, which was issued on December 2nd, 1823. It's called the Monroe Doctrine because it was issued to Congress by James Monroe, although James Monroe did not actually write the doctrine, and indeed it was not called the Monroe Doctrine until much later. Okay, but essentially, crudely speaking, this document mandated that Europeans and Americans essentially stay out of each other's backyards. The Monroe Doctrine is basically a statement of foreign policy that says the United States is no longer to be understood or looked upon by Europeans, or anybody for that matter, as a place of colonialism. You are not to colonize the Americas, and this included what was the United States as well as what is now Latin and Central and South America. Okay, now why is it that the United States is issuing this doctrine in 1823? That's an incredibly important question, one that we are now going to try and address. Let's move on. Okay, so again, the document basically states you're not supposed to look at the United States as a place for colonization, and as we will see later, essentially, the United States promises to stay out of the affairs of Europe. Now, the reason why this is felt as if it's needed to be issued is because around this time, 1819, 1820, 21, 22, 23, 24, Latin America, Central America, South America, had begun to gain independence from their previous colonial powers, particularly Spain. So many countries threw off the shackles of colonialism and established themselves as small independent republics. And there was a concern throughout the United States and elsewhere that perhaps the Spanish and other European powers might attempt to recolonize these areas. And so in an effort to sort of keep that from happening, the United States issues the Monroe Doctrine. Do not come over here and view this area as a place for colonization. Now, this sounds to a degree very benevolent for the United States, right? We want to ensure that these new independent republics are going to be able to thrive, that they're going to be able to grow, right? We don't want them falling under the hand of a colonial power. And to a degree that might have been true, but we also have to recognize that the United States is issuing this Monroe Doctrine because they have a potential vested interest in the survival of these new republics, largely economic interests. Okay. Now, that stated, let's read through this. It says, the statement, known as the Monroe Doctrine, was little noted by the great powers of Europe, but eventually became a long-standing tenet of U.S. foreign policy. Okay. Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams is the son, or was the son to second president, John Adams. John Quincy Adams was the Secretary of State at the time, and in fact, it was John Quincy Adams who wrote the Monroe Doctrine. It was not Monroe himself. But it says Monroe and John Quincy Adams drew upon a foundation of American diplomatic ideals, such as disentanglement from European affairs and defense of neutral rights as expressed in Washington's farewell address, and Madison's stated rationale for waging the War of 1812. So again, I mentioned that the Monroe Doctrine may be regarded by some as the first official statement of U.S. foreign policy, but there is a history upon which the Monroe Doctrine is sitting, and again, it rests on Washington's farewell address, and as it states here, the War of 1812. Now, what did the document suggest? What did it forward? It says the three main concepts of the doctrine were this: separate spheres of influence for the Americas and Europe. In other words, America will be for Americans and their influence, and Europe will be for Europeans and their influence. Americans will stay on this side of the Atlantic. Europeans, you stay on that side of the Atlantic. Okay. Non-colonialization. Okay. No more colonies. And then finally, non-intervention. And this meant that the United States would not interfere in the wars of foreign nations. Okay. And if there happened to still exist colonies in the Americas that had not yet gained their independence, the United States would not interfere with those colonial powers. Okay? These three main concepts of the doctrine were designed to signify a clear break between the New World and what some regarded as the autocratic realm of Europe. Okay? You stay out of our backyard, we'll stay out of yours. Now, the truth of the matter is that the United States issues this Monroe Doctrine, and if a European power had really wanted to challenge the United States, they probably could have successfully done so. In fact, part of the Monroe Doctrine is the United States saying, if you do come and colonize this area, if you do intervene in the affairs of the Americans, then the United States will view this as an act of aggression, and the United States will have to go to war with you. I mean, essentially, that's what was said. If someone had really wanted to push that envelope, if the British had wanted to, if the French had wanted to, if the Prussians had wanted to, yeah, they probably could have whipped America's tail. But luckily for the United States, no one really challenges the Monroe Doctrine until the latter part of the 19th century, early 20th century. And so this statement that the United States gives in 1823 is just that. It is a bark that promises a bite, but luckily the United States never had to actually bite back. So hopefully that metaphor wasn't too belabored. Let's move on. Okay, it says here that Monroe's administration forewarned the imperial European powers against interfering in the affairs of the newly independent Latin American states or potential United States territories. It says while Americans generally objected to European colonies in the New World, they also desired to increase United States influence and trading ties throughout the region in the South. Okay, and again, when we look at the Monroe Doctrine, we have to understand that part of the reason why it's being issued is because the United States has a vested interest in the South part of the Americas, right? They want to have influence there. They want to be able to partake in trade and commerce with Latin America. And indeed, in the latter part of the 19th century and even into the 20th century, the United States acts as a quasi-neo-colonial power. The United States likes to pride itself on being anti-colonialism. We never held colonies. But the truth of the matter is that the United States, even to this day, holds commonwealths. They have possession of various islands that have been used for military strategies, and they've had influence in Latin America in ways that were intrusive. So yeah, the United States in some respects is a kind of neo-colonial power without actually looking like a colonial power. Okay, but I bring that up and I go down the rabbit hole a little bit there simply to stress the point that the United States is not simply issuing this doctrine as a humanitarian measure, right? We're not so concerned about the plight of these young republics and that they need to be able to grow and develop on their own. Yeah, they want that, but there's a reason why they want that, okay? It says, in particular, Americans feared that Spain and France might reassert colonialism over Latin America, who had just overthrown European rule. Signs that Russia was expanding its presence southward from Alaska toward the Oregon Territory were also disconcerting. And so, with all this potential colonial movement, the United States feels the need to forward this doctrine and to let the world know, you stay out of here, we'll stay out of there. All right, let's move on. It says that for their part, the British also had a strong interest in ensuring the demise of Spanish colonialism, with all the trade restrictions mercantilism imposed. Earlier in 1823, British Foreign Minister George Canning actually suggested to Americans that the two nations work bilaterally. In other words, that the British and the United States should create an alliance with one another, and the British could use their navy to support America's doctrine, right? That if in fact a European power tried to fight against the doctrine, you would then have the British there to be able to support the doctrine. But the United States didn't want to work bilaterally. They didn't want to work with the British, and particularly John Quincy Adams was not very keen on allying themselves with the British. And so rather than working bilaterally, the United States chose to issue this doctrine unilaterally, in and of themselves, by their own. It says here that John Quincy Adams also argued that the British were not committed to recognizing the Latin American republics and must have also had for themselves imperial motivations. And so the United States chooses not to align with the British. All right, let's move on. Okay, so it states here that the bilateral statement proposed by the British thereby became a unilateral declaration by the United States. As Monroe stated, and this is actually language from the doctrine itself, it says, the American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European power. It says Monroe outlined two separate spheres of influence, the Americas and Europe. The independent lands of the Western Hemisphere would be solely the United States' domain. In exchange for this domain, the United States pledged to avoid involvement in the political affairs of Europe, such as the ongoing Greek struggle for independence, and not to interfere with existing European colonies that were already in the Americas. Okay, and so the United States does recognize that there are some colonies that still exist in the Americas, and we won't get in. We're not going to interfere with those, but anything else will be regarded as an act of aggression. Okay, but again, this was issued unilaterally, not bilaterally. The British did not get that alliance as they had wished. So, all right, let's finish up with this last slide. Let's move forward. Okay, it says, by the mid-1800s, Monroe's declaration, combined with ideas of manifest destiny, which manifest destiny, hopefully by this point, you have some idea of what this is, but if not, manifest destiny is the concept that there is a God-given providence that the United States or the white man should overspread the entire American continent from sea to shining sea to create what some historians and myself would argue was an American empire. But it says Monroe's declaration, combined with ideas of manifest destiny, provided precedent and support for U.S. expansion on the American continent, right? This area here, the Americas, is the domain, it's the sphere of influence for the United States, and because God has ordained for us to overspread the continent, we are going to spread that sphere of influence. It says, in the late 1800s, U.S. economic and military power enabled it to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. It says the doctrine's greatest extension came with Theodore Roosevelt's corollary, which inverted the original meaning of the doctrine and came to justify unilateral intervention in Latin America. Now, to get any further into what TR did to the Monroe Doctrine is, that's for a different class. But one question I would pose to us is this. Does this doctrine still apply today? Do the tenets of this doctrine still apply? Because they were in place throughout all of the 19th century. Okay? For the most part, this doctrine of non-interference and spheres of influence, it dictated how the United States dealt with foreign policy throughout all of the 19th century, and one could even argue well into World War II, or right before World War II, because the United States remained, isolationists prior to World War I and World War II, not getting involved. Following World War II, of course, I would argue that the Monroe Doctrine in many ways was thrown away and not used. But this is a question I think maybe we might want to ask ourselves. Is the doctrine still with us today? Now, you don't have to watch this. It's not a required film, but I think it's an interesting one. And if you click on that film, what you're going to see is the Secretary of State John Kerry speaking, and within the first 4 or 5 minutes or so, he talks about the Monroe Doctrine, and he makes an important and interesting claim about it. And I would be interested to hear what you have to say. I'd like to know what your thoughts are about his comments, and particularly about what he thinks about the Monroe Doctrine. So, again, not required, but interested in just seeing what you think about it. If you have an opportunity, go ahead and click on that, watch that. But otherwise, I think that pretty much covers what I wanted to look at in this particular lecture. Not too long, but just to give you a sense of what these things were. So, with that, and as always, go in peace, be warm and filled, may the force be with you, and live long and prosper.